is it to be here? Yeah, you can be seated. I couldn't wait to get here. Had to fly nearly 30 hours, but anyway, I couldn't wait to get here and to all of our locations all around the world. Literally, I kind of feel that lifechurch.tv is a little bit like God, you know. It's kind of like omnipresent. You're like everywhere and growing. Obviously, I love to see new network churches join, and wherever you are, I'm so glad that you're part of this. I hope you understand my accent, and I'm from a little bit further south than here, if you kind of just fly really south for a long time. I'm from Sydney, Australia, the great land down under, but I'm not the crocodile hunter. I don't like animals, I'm sorry. But anyway, Nick and I couldn't wait to get here, and I am married to the single most ravishing piece of masculine flesh on planet Earth, and my husband is the 12th of 13 living children, and so there's parts of Australia that have no television, and that's where he was from. But he's actually, I'm thinking Pastor Craig and Amy need to catch up because there's still like only 6, so they need to have at least another 7 more. And we have 2 little girls, my little Catherine Bobby and my little Sophia Joyce. I have a 7-year-old and a 3-year-old, and we have the awesome privilege of traveling and helping to build the body of Christ worldwide and reach the lost. I couldn't think of anything better to do with our lives. And so when I was invited to come here, I can't even explain to you the excitement. I'm like a little kid in a candy shop. I'm so pumped to be here, and you guys are truly touching the earth. And I'm not just saying that. Pastor Craig came to our Hillsong conference and was unbelievable. I mean, he's very, very well loved in Australia. I've got to tell you, his teaching was so radical. And sometimes, you know, I was in a car in Copenhagen, and I was raving about how great it was. And the cab driver said to me, he was very emotional, he said to me, "Do you really think my city is so awesome?" And I said, "It's unbelievable." And he said these words that I'll never forget. He said, "Sometimes you can be right in the midst of it and not even see it. And sometimes you can be part of an awesome church and planted in an awesome church in different locations all around the world under such great apostolic leadership and not quite even realize what you've got. But let me just say, you ought to thank God that you're under such great leadership. You ought to thank God daily for Pastor Craig and Amy and all they've done and their commitment to building a great Bible-based church that's touching the earth, reaching the lost, and going to make a difference for Jesus on the earth. So you ought to thank God. I've got to tell you that much. You know, we need a lot more of such churches because we have a desperate world that desperately needs Jesus Christ. Nick and I were suffering for Jesus in Florence a while ago, and someone had to do it. We said, "Here we are, Lord, send us." But anyway, we were there, and we went up to a cathedral that in its heyday probably housed about 7,000 people, this humongous sanctuary. Amazing artwork all around the walls. I mean, the architecture in and of itself was phenomenal. And we had to pay €5 to go in, climb to the top of the steeple, and look out across the city. And I remember when I was on top of that steeple looking out, I just started to cry. And I thought, Lord, whoever built this church, however many, well, that was built over many, many years, all the years of building, all the people that were involved in building, all the giving that was required to build such a church, they didn't do that with the intention that maybe 100 or 200 years' time, that this church would be just a tourist attraction, just a monument, somewhere where you pay €5 to go in and look at a city. This thing that had once been a life-giving, thriving church now was just a dead, empty monument, a testimony to what God once did in a city. I was thinking about all the people that might have found relationship with Christ there, maybe found healing, marriages restored, people finding life and hope, and yet now it was this dead, empty tourist attraction. And the reason I started crying was I said, Lord, how do I know this isn't going to happen to our church? You know, nowadays everyone knows Hillsong Church for all its great songs, and I know many of you were excited, thinking that here's a woman from Hillsong with blonde hair, even though it's dyed to cover the gray. But anyway, here's a woman from Hillsong here, and she's going to break forth into Shout to the Lord. But honestly, if I was to sing Shout to the Lord today, you would all cry to the Lord, so it's not going to happen. But, you know, here's a church known for all its music. It's a greatly built church in Sydney, Australia, and around the world. And how do I know that this isn't going to happen in 100 or 200 years' time? How do we know that this isn't going to happen to lifechurch.tv? How do we know? There are no guarantees. Whoever built that church didn't think that was going to happen. And a little phrase dropped in my heart that really helped me to understand a lot of things. This was the phrase that dropped in, and I felt the Lord just say, Chris, this is what happens when the church stops being the church and the church just starts doing church on a Sunday. When we just start going through the motions of some boring religious ritual or obligation, even if we've got great music and great screens and great technology, when we stop being the church of Jesus Christ and them being engaged in what Jesus is passionate about, then you know what? We just become a dead, empty monument, nothing more than just a ritualistic kind of building that someone goes to and just goes through the motions. You see, we need to ensure that our heart beats for the same thing that God's heart beats for, and that's for a lost and a broken world. The Bible says in the book of Matthew that Jesus came to seek and save that which was lost. God is consumed with the lost, and we ought to be passionate for what He is passionate about. You see, passion is really the seedbed of reaching a lost and a dying world. We ought to be passionate. You know, if you're still passionate about your relationship with God and about your Christian life, when you're not just going through the motions because you do what you want out of passion, but you just do what you have to when it's an obligation. Like Nick and I, when we met, I went in to do a relief lecture in Bible school, to do an evangelism lecture. He was a student, I was a teacher. We're the same age, but he went to college later than me. And I went in, and he tells this story. He kind of fell in love with the teacher. Now, we had a rule at the time in our college that students couldn't date, but we had no rules about students and teachers. So we kind of, Nick thought, I'm going to go on a little kind of adventure to try to date the teacher. So he suddenly became very interested in community-based evangelism and kept making appointments to see me over that. But you know, he found out from my best friend that I swam at 6 o'clock every morning at our local pool. Now, I had never seen him down at our local swimming pool. I'd been doing this for a year. Then all of a sudden, I'd go down the pool, and every morning at 6 o'clock, there was a guy doing laps up and down the pool. Well, after about a week, we bumped into each other. And I said, Nick, what are you doing down here? He goes, you know, that kind of male defensive. What do you mean, what am I doing here? I'm always here at 6 o'clock in the morning. I love swimming at 6 o'clock in the morning. Now, church, I've been married to the guy for 14 years. Never once, not even once, in 14 years has my husband ever got up at 6 o'clock in the morning and gone down to our pool to swim. Because you see, you do what you want out of passion. No one has to make you read the Bible. No one has to make you go to church. No one has to make you tithe. No one has to make you passionately be involved with a lost and a broken world. It comes out of your love relationship with God. It's just what you do. No one has to make you. It's not a boring religious obligation. I mean, when Mel Gibson made that movie, The Passion of the Christ, anyone see that? What a wonderful film. Well, did you notice it wasn't called The Boring Religious Obligation of the Christ? It was called The Passion. In fact, when The Passion was released, 2 weeks later, I was in Baton Rouge, and Jim Caviezel was in this restaurant that we were in. Now, I am not normally starstruck, okay, but I have to admit, he was sitting across there, and because the movie so moved me, I was starting to freak out. So very inappropriately loudly, I yelled out across the restaurant, and Nick was sitting right there, but I'm going to Nick, oh my gosh, there's Jesus! Okay, Nick's like, Chris, you should know the difference. But anyway, so I mean, I was like freaking. So he said, okay, the guy that we were with knew the man that was with Jim Caviezel. So he said, I'll take you to introduce you. And I'm like, oh no, I was like, oh, anyway. So I went over, and Jim was there, and the man said to him, hi, this is Christine Caine, my friend from Australia. Didn't say what I did, didn't say anything other than that. And so he looked at me and just locked eyes. And if you saw those eyes on the cross, all I'm thinking about was they mustn't have used filters because they're... Anyway, so I'm like, those eyes. And so he stood up, and he's really tall and I'm not. So he's looking down at me, and he said, these are the first words he said to me. He goes, there are not many believers in Australia, are there? I didn't know what to say. I'm like, no, nobody believes in Australia. There are no believers in Australia. I was like freaking out. So then I'm not joking. For the next 15 minutes, he full on started witnessing to me. I mean, everything, the cross, the blood, the resurrection. He was so passionate, I didn't have the heart to tell him I was a Christian. I mean, I was just like, and then I'm not joking, about halfway through, I'd already made up my mind. If he was going to ask me to